Welcome! So now that we've installed Ruby on Rails, the question is which editor or IDE should we be using to edit our Ruby on Rails applications? So there are a bunch of choices. Number one, there is RubyMine, and RubyMine is made by JetBrains, which incidentally is the same company that makes IntelliJ, which is an excellent Java IDE out there. And RubyMine is no different. A lot of Rubyists prefer using RubyMine. It's a very good IDE. Now it's not free, so you'll get a 30-day trial to see if you like it, and then after that you have to purchase a license. But it's an excellent IDE, and I encourage you guys to try it out if you are into IDEs. Another IDE out there is Aptana, which is also a pretty good IDE. I personally never used it, but some Rubyists definitely like using Aptana Studio 3. Then a lot of Rubyists are not into IDEs altogether. They use Vim. Vim is an editor which is very lightweight, and it has a lot of plugins that make Ruby and Rails development easier, but it's not a full-blown IDE. But again, a lot of Rubies do prefer using it. And then there is Sublime Text, which is also not a full-blown IDE. It's a text editor with a lot of plugins, but I personally really like using it, and let me show you guys how it works. So when you open up the Sublime Text Editor, you're not going to have any directories or folders in there. And the way I got this Rails app in there was by doing File and then Open, and then picking the folder that I was trying to open, which was my first app folder. And this is just a Rails application that's about courses on Coursera. So the first thing that we might want to do is we might want to change the color scheme if you guys like the white background instead of a dark background. So for example, let's open up a file just to see what we're doing here. So this is the color scheme right now, but it's very easy to change the color scheme. And the way you would do that is by going to Sublime Text Preferences, and then color scheme. Right now it's on Blackboard color scheme, but you could easily change it to something like Mac Classic, but flips it to the white background instead of the other background. So let's go ahead and change it back. A lot of things actually in this editor are customizable. And the way to see which properties are available for customization, you would look in Preferences and then Settings Default. And I am demoing this on the Mac, but on the Windows and on Linux, which the editor runs on, these settings are going to be very similar. So the interesting part is the settings are not on a GUI panel that you could just do a checkbox them. They're actually a JSON file. So you have a key and a value. So for example, you have line numbers. It says line numbers should be true, but we don't see any line numbers. And the reason for that is because the line numbers were overridden by a user file. So if you go into Preferences, Settings User, you'll see that the user file has line numbers as false. But if I go ahead and take them out and save a file, you could see the line numbers show right back up again. Now, wouldn't it be nice to see the user file right next to the default file side by side so that you could actually know which properties you could edit? And it turns out you could do it very easily if you go to View and lay out 2 columns instead of 1. You could see this line here. So we see that there are actually 2 columns here right now. And we could drag one of the files over to the other column, So now this is our user file, and this is our default file, and we could easily add properties in the user file, overriding the properties in the other files. So for example, numbers is false, save it, boom, they go away. So let's go back and put the layout back to single. Okay. The other customizations that you could do in actually a very similar vein to what we just did is for key bindings. So Sublime comes with its own key bindings, which are on by default, and you can override those defaults again by going to preferences, key bindings user, and you can actually override them with your own key bindings that you're used to. The next feature I want to show is find in files. So find in files, it's under the find menu, find in files, it's Command Shift F on the Mac. And basically you can try to look for things all over in all the files that are open. That's the default. Open files and folders. So for example, you know that there is a variable courses somewhere in there. You're not sure exactly where it is. So you type that in, it gives you results. And actually, from this point on, you could actually double click on the results. So for example, if you double click on courses here, it opens up that file right away. So what I like about Sublime is that it's very lightweight, but at the same time, it has a lot of features that your typical IDEs would have. And actually, speaking of finding files, if you go to finding files, the options for how to look for things, you have an option to use regular expressions, and this is for find and for replace. So you could very easily find and replace something, even using a regular expression in a whole bunch of files, which is very powerful. You can do a case sensitive, obviously. You could do look for whole world and whole word and things like that. Another option which I really like about Sublime, and this actually blew me away the first time I saw it, is the go to anything option. It's Command P on the Mac, and I think it's Control P on Windows. And basically the idea is you want to look for a certain file. This is similar to how you would look for a file in Eclipse, for example, by doing Control Shift R or Command Shift R. So you do a Command P, which brings up this dialog, and you're looking for a file. Let's say you know a file is called index something. Index, oh, that's what it is. Now, if you noticed, the interesting part is it's not just telling you what the available files are that you might be looking for. It actually displays the content of a file in the background, which is pretty amazing. So let's see that again. So you have index, and it's actually displaying the file as you are typing what you think the file is. And at that point, you could just hit enter, and you go straight to that file, which is pretty cool. Another feature which might not be so obvious, but it's pretty obvious once you see it once, is that you could actually collapse things. So there's no way, so looking at this, you don't think there's any way to collapse code, but if you go to the left of the panel, you could see that there is triangles, which actually they only come into existence when you sort of hover over them. So for example, this table element, which goes from the open table tag to the closed table tag, you can click on the triangle and it's going to collapse this. So this way you could save some real estate if you want to see a whole bunch of stuff on the screen at the same time. The other thing you could do in Sublime So even though it's just a text editor, but it has support for certain what are called builders. So for example, if you're looking at a typical Ruby file, and we're not going to get into what this Ruby file does, but at the end of it, you are printing something out. So if you go to Tools and Build, which is Command B or Control B, there is automatic support for building or running certain languages, and Ruby is one of them. So when you open up your whatever file .rb in Sublime, you could do Command B or Control B, and it runs the file, and the output gets printed out right here. So you don't have to go to the command line. You could run it directly from the editor. So again, it's it's a text editor, but it has a lot of features built on top of it, which makes it really nice. And this is actually just scratching the surface, because Sublime has many plugins and packages, and there's actually a website called packagecontrol.io, which keeps track of all the and lists a whole bunch of Sublime Text plugins out there, ones that are trending, popular, and there's stuff like support for Git, which basically means you could download a plugin that will tell you what has changed and things like that, or support for Markdown, for Markdown syntax, or for being able to view Markdown output in the browser, a whole bunch of plugins that you can add onto your Sublime basic installation to make it even better. So those are basically your choices. I, I personally like Sublime, which is why I showed you how I use it, but we did list a whole bunch of choices out there. Number one, RubyMine, which is really good. Aptana, which I've never used, but I hear good things about it. And Vim, which a lot of Rubyists will tell you that IDE, why would you ever want to use an IDE? Just use Vim, and it works for them, which is great. And then the one that I just showed you, which is Sublime Text.